I'm going to speed through stuff to get this in 30 minutes. But basically what I want to talk about is I think a lot of you probably got interested in atheism and activism probably several years ago at a time when it was super exciting and it seemed like it was getting bigger and bigger. And then it kind of faded away. And I'm going to depress you, but then I promise I will lift you up later on. Let me tell you my own history with this stuff really quick. I became an atheist when I was a teenager. I went to college and I started an atheist group there. That led me to start working with a lot of the national organizations for atheism. And then I started writing about it and talking about it sometime after that, which is all to say I've been doing activism and working and writing about atheism for like the better part of 20 plus years at this point. So it's long enough to have seen a lot of the trends come and go. And so I think one aspect of that is what was exciting for me about atheism and like having this belief that seems so right and yet so not known by a lot of people was that sometime in like the mid-2000s, it seemed like a whole bunch of people were suddenly interested in this very niche topic because there were books everywhere and all these media sort of, all these people were talking about atheism after I had gotten really interested in that topic. Were many of you in that same boat where like the new atheism thing happened, but it was after you were already atheists? How many people does that apply to? Like half the room at this point. And then the thing is, that seems to have faded away after a while. And I'll give you some numbers behind this if this works. I hope you could see this okay. This is like a Google Trends chart of just the phrase new atheists. And this starts at 2006 and goes all the way to today. And all this means is that the term new atheist was really popular in 2006, and it has gotten progressively less popular over time. And maybe you're thinking that's just the term, new atheist, in quotation marks. If you do the same thing with new atheism, you see the exact same line, you see the exact same trend. And if you do the same thing for the word atheism, which is way more popular than like a two-word phrase, the same thing sort of happens. Atheism as a thing was really popular in 2006, relatively speaking. And then over time, that phrase, the word, has just become less of a thing people care about. They don't search for it on Google as much as they used to, which is telling. If you're curious about it, they're just not looking it up as much. And it seems like if that's indicative of this movement that so many of us in this room care about, that seems like it would be really bad news. Here's another way of looking at that same trend. I know this is hard to see, that's okay. I took this snapshot on Amazon this week, and this is basically the 20 most popular books in the atheism category. And the thing you might notice about these books, even if you can't see them, is that a whole bunch of them come from that same like 2 to 3 year window from like 2006 onward. Like if you look around here, you see Christopher Hitchens' books, you see the God Delusion, Sam Harris books are on there too. You see different versions of those books. You see Christian rebuttals to those books. And what you see very little of are books that just came out in the past like year or two, which is weird because if we're talking about a bestsellers list, you would expect it to be inundated with new stuff that people want to buy right now, but it's not. There's a couple books on there, like one from Seth Andrews, Andrew Seidel, things like that, but it's not a lot. And the question is whether those books will have staying power. But the thing is, I think what this tells me is that our movement, and I use that phrase loosely, our movement today is still kind of defined by what those guys wrote 15, 20 years ago. Like, there hasn't been much change in that regard. I'll keep going down this path. This was the Reason rally that happened in 2012, which was billed as the largest gathering of atheists in American history. There's no actual numbers, there's no attendance numbers, but it was estimated at like well over 20,000 by people who just make numbers up. But there was a lot of people there. And then they did it again in 2016, and it just, whatever you want to say about it, it just didn't have as many people. And I promise you they're never going to do it again. It's just a lot of money, and also if you're looking for speakers who fit the definition of people who should speak at a Reason rally, good luck unifying anybody over who constitutes those speakers. And on top of that, sorry for the picture, but like they used to bring atheists on like Fox News to debate things. They don't do that anymore. Why? Because they realize they could just talk about us. They don't need us there. So like we don't have any conversations about religion in a place of prominence. You're not seeing atheists interviewed on, let's say, late night talk shows, which is a thing that actually happened for a while. Speaking personally, as someone who's written about atheism for a while, there used to be a ton of blogs and websites about atheism. Those have gone away. I mean, I say this personally, it's really hard to do it like full time. Magazines, a lot of people may have become atheists because they saw Free Inquiry or Skeptical Inquirer magazines, maybe in a local library way back when. Those have become, that's not a place people get their information from. And all of this, everything I'm saying up to this point is to say, if you're not already an atheist, two things are happening. One is it's not really easy to find a lot of information about that topic. And two, if you do find information, it's the stuff we had, like Atheism 101 stuff from 15 to 20 years ago. Not a lot seems to have changed, and that seems pretty bad for a movement, because all of us think we are reasonable people. When it comes to religion, we're the ones who are right. And that's not to denigrate people who are religious, but it means like this thing we're super passionate about doesn't seem to have as much power as it used to, and that is not fun anymore. Now, okay, I'm done with the depressing part of all this. I still say all this to say I'm still super optimistic about what's going on in this movement, and I want to spend the rest of the time telling you why I'm optimistic about all this stuff when it seems like everything's going in the other direction. The first reason is that all the demographics seem to be shifting in our favor. And we saw that happening a long time ago, but it's like still happening, and it's still happening really quickly. And this is one example of it. This is from the Pew Research Center, and this is just a straight up, what religion are you in the United States? And this starts in 2007 on the left and gets to, I think, 2022 on the far right there. But Christianity is at the top. In 2007, 78% of American adults said they were Christian, of whatever denomination you want to say. That has gone down over the years. What's gone up? The number of people with no religion. I think it was mentioned earlier, but we're talking about 3 out of every 10 Americans are not religious in any meaningful way. Doesn't mean they are atheists, but it means they have no religious label. It doesn't mean as much to them as it used to. They are not necessarily going to church. And if you look at the way these trends are going, it's not like they stop being Christian and become a different religion. It means they're ditching Christianity and becoming none of the above. Like, those are gains on our side, in a sense, if we get to take control of that. This is another way of looking at the same data. This is the same chart. This is what percentage of Americans have no religion whatsoever, but broken down by generations. And the very bottom, the yellow line there, that's the greatest generation, kind of the oldest Americans. And even there, you could see as we move to the right, even that number, it goes up. More people who are older Americans are becoming non-religious. Yeah, it's a small percentage, but it's still going up. And it doesn't matter whether you're looking at the silent generation, boomers, Generation X, there is a trend going upward. More of them are becoming nuns as they grow older, which is weird. You would think, like, as you get older, you become more religious. That's not happening at all. And maybe you're looking at this and you're like, well, where are millennials? Where are the younger Americans on this list? Here are the millennials for you. Like, they started super non-religious and they keep going up. And so we are entering this crazy time when I shouldn't say most, but we're getting to the point where, like, if you go to a big high school in America, you can't swing your arms in the hallway without, like, hitting someone who is not religious. Again, I'm not that old, but I swear when I was an atheist in high school, I don't think I knew anyone else who was an atheist in high school. I started a group in college because I was hoping to meet other people who were non-religious. That's not a problem anymore, depending on where you live and, like, the sort of place you grow up in, I know. But in general, I think just like a lot of people my age or older, maybe you only knew one or two people who were LGBTQ. I don't know. I work with a local high school, and it's like everyone knows someone who's gay, or arguably they know someone who's trans as well. It's just not an issue as much. They all know somebody. They know what the issues are, and the same thing is happening for people without religion, and that includes places like in the Bible Belt. It's not that hard to find people who are non-religious. Here's another way of looking at that data. This is the share of American adults who say, remember, for those of you who read The God Delusion, Dawkins had this, like, spectrum where he said, a 1 means you know for a fact, like, God does not exist. I'm sorry, that God does exist. And, like, a 7 is you know for a fact that God does not exist. And where are you on that spectrum? And he said in the book, he's like, I would put myself at a 6. Okay, maybe 6.9 or something like that. But the whole point was, of course you can't say with certainty that God doesn't exist, but all the evidence, there's no evidence for it, so he's like really close to certain without going that far. This is the percentage of Americans who would put themselves at a 1. Like they're 100% sure God exists. And in 1988, on the left here, that number was at like 60-some%. Most Americans were absolutely certain that God existed. And the reason I want to show you this is what's happened since then, because the latest time they did this survey, this is from something called the General Social Survey. It's just a massive survey, lots of data. For the first time in 2021, that number dipped below 50% for the first time. So what does that mean? That means at least half of Americans are willing to say, okay, I have at least some doubt about God's existence, which is wild. That seems like something that you wouldn't expect to have happened. So here's the question for you. And this goes back to why I'm optimistic about like the atheism movement in a sense. Why is this happening? Why are people becoming non-religious, even if they're not atheists? Why are they doubting God's existence, if that's the case? Why is all that happening? I have some theories, and so let's talk about that. This is an article that was written for Salon by a sociologist, Phil Zuckerman, who's written some wonderful books about atheism and like demographics and studies and all that. I want to read this to you. It's amazing. He's basically saying when it comes to morality, you know, the thing you constantly hear from the Christian right is like, we're the family values people. We're the moral majority. But here's what Phil writes here. In terms of who supports helping refugees, affordable health care for all, accurate sex education, death with dignity, gay rights, trans rights, animal rights, and as to who opposes militarism, government use of torture, the death penalty, corporal punishment, and so on, the correlation remains. The most secular Americans exhibit the most care for the suffering of others, while the most religious exhibit the highest level of indifference. Like, you name your topic, whatever thing you're passionate about, it seems like what's the moral, ethical side of that issue? We're on it. And the religious right is so not on that side of the spectrum. And I don't mean to paint religious people with a broad brush. We all know there are plenty of religious people who take the moral, ethical side on this issue, on any of these issues. But like, if just to pick like LGBTQ rights, the loudest, most vocal side of that on the religious side are the ones trying to suppress civil rights and fight against it, while the non-religious side of things are like, yeah, we are for human rights. It's not a hard argument. Here's what that looks like in practice. This is before the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe, but Americans' views on abortion by religious group. And the dark blue line in the middle is like all Americans. 57% of all Americans said we support abortion rights to some degree or another. Where are atheists on this chart? We're the ones way up there. 87% of atheists support abortion rights. We are losing to Unitarian Universalists. We got to do a little better there. But if you look way at the bottom, like those are some of the most hardcore religious groups you're going to find. And again, what are they saying? They're the ones supporting forced birth. They're the ones saying, no, there's no circumstance under which an abortion would be okay, which is a really hard thing to defend, especially when you keep hearing stories about what is happening in states where abortions are prohibited or really hard to access. So again, on one of the most contentious, like, civil rights, moral issues of our time right now, it's the non-religious side, or I should say, like, the moderate Christian side, who are on the ethical side of the issue. We're the ones with compassion for people who are pregnant. I should say, by the way, under atheists, there is agnostic, you got Jewish, Buddhist, Episcopals. So, like, those are the people trying to help people who are pregnant. Here's another way of looking at it. This is for trans rights. Do you think your sex is determined at birth, meaning trans people are making it all up? And the thing is, white evangelicals there, 84% of white evangelicals are like, oh yeah, whatever genitalia you're born with, we're done. The conversation is over. But atheists and agnostics at the bottom there, only 29% believe that. Still too high for my personal taste. But the point is, when it comes to accepting trans people, we're the ones who are willing and able to accept them, and we're the ones fighting for their rights in general. The most loudest, most powerful religious blocs, not so much. This one, I'll run through this quickly. This is just death penalty. Again, should we have government executions for any reason? White evangelicals, 75% of them support government execution. Atheists, 65% oppose it. So again, take your pick of whatever issue you want. There's atheists down there. One last one. This was before vaccines for COVID were available. They asked, would you get a vaccine for COVID if it was available to you? And the thing is, what I'm assuming most of us know about vaccines is it's not just about your personal health, it's about the health of everybody around you too, to get vaccinated. Like, that is a moral question. And the thing is, white evangelicals, what percent of them will absolutely get vaccinated? 54%. Atheists, 90%. And again, I would argue, like, that was before the vaccines became a cultural touch point. So I think the white evangelical number probably went down after they were available. But the point is, like, if you're looking for people who are taking the moral, the ethical approach, if you're a young person in America and you're thinking about what the culture wars issues are of our time, who's taking the humanistic approach? Who's taking the compassionate approach? It's not the people who claim to be the family values crowd or the compassionate crowd. It's the people who are like, no, I have no religion whatsoever. So even if they're not using the word atheist, they're heading to our side when it comes to the issues that excites the wrong word, but like that excites a lot of us that we're really passionate about. Let me keep jumping around here. The bottom line is like, I think one of the things that's happening when it comes to atheist activism, the thing that I think excited a lot of us for a long time, is that we seem to be moving past the word. The word atheist doesn't mean as much as it used to, and maybe that's disappointing if you're really gung-ho on like trying to convince people God doesn't exist, which was, I think, a popular argument debate to have. It used to be really popular to have those debates, and now it's something you do with people you don't like on the internet. But in terms of the stuff like, why does it matter to any of us that other people are not religious? Like, I don't win any points if you say you don't believe in God. I don't get anything for that, and I don't waste my time with those arguments. I want people to be atheists because I'm really disturbed by the direction religion can sometimes lead people to go. And it seems like we can just leapfrog the label thing, and people are moving in the direction most of us would go anyway. And to me, that seems like a net win. Here's the other thing to think about. For those of you who were interested in this world, atheist world, in like 2006, all that new atheism stuff, think about what we were hoping to do. A lot of it for me, just speaking personally, was about making it easier for people to understand what atheism was, making those resources available to people, making sure people were comfortable with doubt, making sure atheists remain on the rational, thoughtful, humanistic side of these controversial issues. On a lot of those things, the resources are available. I'll talk about that in a little bit. I think people are able to figure out how to navigate having doubts because there's so many other ways people have been talking about it that you can hear stories that affect you personally. You can find yourself in other people's stories. And on the issues, we're the ones taking that moral approach. Like, that's not the work of Madeleine Murray O'Hair or like a new atheist author. That's the work of like generations of activists trying to make this into a thing that people are not stigmatizing. And atheist is not as dirty of a word as it used to be, which is a wonderful thing. So here's the second reason I think I'm optimistic about all this stuff. I think, for those of you who have been involved in large atheist organizations, if I told you really quickly, I went to college, that doesn't mean that much. Because for those of you who went to college, you don't just go to college, you go to a specific type of college. You go to a college because maybe cost matters to you, maybe the programs they offer mean something to you, maybe you like a big college versus a small college, and that's good because you can filter out where you want to go based on what matters to you. When all that new atheism stuff was happening, there were a handful of really large national atheist organizations that almost by definition had to cater to everybody because we didn't have enough people or resources to divvy it up into little groups. Like, just to pick one, like American Atheists had to be all things to all people because there wasn't a lot of game in town. And I think for those of you who explored this stuff before the internet, same thing. If you found a website about atheism, it was trying to cover everything. If you read The God Delusion, it covers like very superficially what atheism is and doesn't really get into any nuance. What's really interesting is there are so many non-religious people in America these days. Again, 30% minimum are non-religious. It's probably a lot higher, and especially depending on the survey you use. There are so many millions, tens of millions of people who are non-religious that they could do entire studies. This one is from American Atheists, but they can do different studies just on our community in a way they never could before. It used to be that if you saw atheists in a survey, we would be the asterisk at the bottom because there wasn't enough of us to get a good sample size. There's so many of us, they can now dig into who we are, what differentiates us from each other, which is really neat. Part of that also means this is an entire giant multi-million-dollar study. This is from the University of Kent understanding unbelief. There's another one right now taking place at the University of Belfast, I believe, in Northern Ireland, that's just understanding atheism. Who are these people? What is it that they believe? Why do they believe this stuff? What happens if you're an atheist in a religious country that's more of a theocracy? Like, we're getting into questions that are so interesting and so fascinating that goes beyond just, what's your label? Why do you not believe in God? Which I think is interesting. I'm going to go back to that in a second. The fact is, there are now groups, whether or not you know about them or belong to them, there are groups for atheists of color, atheists who come from different religious backgrounds, ex-Muslims, ex-Mormons, what have you, and they don't just have to stick to whatever national atheist group exists out there. They have found their own communities, which I think is a strength of our entire movement, because there are things I will never understand about being, a black person raised in a religious environment. I didn't have that experience, and those national groups don't necessarily have the experience or can provide resources, but those groups can, and there are so many of them. And I think that's a strength, that we can blossom and have all these different, very tiny groups, but that cater to different communities. That's awesome. So here's an example of what that looks like in practice. How many of you know who that is? Just raise your hand. It's fine if you don't. I see like a couple of hands. That's fine. I'll come back to it. How many of you know this guy? Couple people. Not that many. Couple people. Same deal. Okay. And I'm going to... I don't think the video works here, so I won't show you the video. Same deal. Do you know who that is? Couple people. Here's the thing. Those people are some of the most popular names, faces on YouTube or TikTok for the religious group from which they left. So just going back here for a second, this is Lloyd Evans, who is on YouTube and talks... Whoa. Whoops, my bad. He talks a lot about what it was like to be a former Jehovah's Witness. And I'm telling you, I have been to parties with a group like this, and if someone tells me they are a former Jehovah's Witness, I swear, my first question, because I'm a nerd, is, oh, do you watch Lloyd's stuff? And their eyes light up, because they're like, you know Lloyd? It's like, yes, I know Lloyd. Because, again, if you're a former Jehovah's Witness, I will tell you, the God delusion won't do anything for you. But watching a guy who grew up in your very niche religious circle and who can talk about what the problems with it are, that connects with you in a way Dawkins never could. This is John DeLynn, who does Mormon Stories podcast, but he's an ex-Mormon. And again, if you're from that religious community and you left it, there are things he can talk about that a lot of us who were not Mormon never could. And it makes a lot more sense, and you connect with that guy. This is Ellie, who does Ex-Fundy Diaries on YouTube. Awesome channel. And this is Abraham Piper. If you don't know him, you might have heard of his father, John Piper, who is a fundamentalist Christian preacher. Abraham over here is really popular on TikTok because he is not his father, and he spends a lot of time talking about that. And it's the same thing, when you hear these people, how many of you have seen this documentary that came out last week? Shiny, Happy People, about the Duggars. The hook for that series on Amazon is that this is a series about the Duggar family, and maybe you've heard of the Duggars, and maybe you watched their show on TLC, but if you actually watch the series, it's 4 episodes. 3 of the episodes were really about a specific religious community they are a part of, and a lot of the talking heads in the documentary series are from people who come from that fundamentalist Christian background. And again, if you read subreddits dedicated to fundamentalist Christianity or former fundamentalists, that's the thing they loved about the series, that it talks and exposes so much of what they grew up with in a way they don't usually see echoed in mainstream media or in popular books. So the fact that they're not talking about atheism. They're just saying, this is the religious community I grew up in. This is what's wrong with it. This is how it hurt me. And to have those people, even if most of us have not heard of them, I'm telling you, there are so many mini Richard Dawkins out there, but for specific communities, and they are connecting with so many more people, and I don't think it gets the attention it deserves. And that is huge. Like, the God delusion paints all religion with a broad brush, I think. And it has to. I'm not even upset about that. It's a book. It's a book for a mass audience. It can't get into specifics about what Mormons believe or Jehovah's Witnesses believe. It has to treat religion as a thing. But all of the people I'm talking about here can really dig into the specific problems of their background, and that connects with a lot of people who are searching for it, which is really neat. I don't know, it's hard to see this. One of the largest subreddits on the website Reddit is Reddit Atheism, which has like 3 million members. Doesn't mean they all use it, but that's the number. But there's a really interesting thing if you ever visit the atheism subreddit. At the top, there's a little, you get a menu, and you could dig into specific topics. So they have like, if you like discussing religion, having debates, there are certain subreddits you can go to for that. If you want to look at visual content, you like memes, they got memes. But there is a section called EX, X groups. And if you dig into that list, they have like a subreddit for ex-Catholics, ex-Muslims, ex-Jews. What else do you got there? Ex-Hindus, ex-JW for Jehovah's Witnesses. Like, there are tiny communities. I'm not saying those are million people strong, but there are tiny communities, not just for people who left faith, which means nothing because it's so broad, but left your faith, and they are part of your community. I grew up in a religion called Jainism. There is an ex-Jain community. I swear, growing up, I would have thought there's like 4 Jains in the country, but there are little communities, and they're talking about things that like I grew up with and names and gods I'm familiar with that no one's around me has heard of, but like to hear anyone else talk about it and why they think it's wrong, I'm telling you, it's a breath of fresh air. It's amazing. On top of that, you have groups, I mentioned like ex-Muslims of North America. It is a group that works with a lot of national atheist groups, but again, specifically, they are trying to help people who are Muslim or ex-Muslim and trying to leave it because there are specific issues with that they have to navigate that a lot of us may not understand. This is another website called Footsteps. Guess what this is for? Former what? Orthodox Jews, specifically. Because again, they have to navigate different problems than a lot of the rest of us. I'm telling you, it is so neat that there are so many organizations, whether they're official nonprofits or just forums online, for people who left smaller religions, and that stuff didn't exist like 10, 15 years ago, certainly not to the level that exists now. And that is the work of a lot of people saying like, look, I like that there's this new atheism stuff out there. I like that people are talking about it, but you're not addressing the stuff I left. You're not addressing what my family taught me or what my religious community taught me. And the fact that there are so many of these is kind of incredible. And this stuff happens everywhere. There are podcasts for whatever ex-religion you left. There are YouTube channels for it. Books, maybe less books, but like social media outlets for all of this stuff that did not exist a long time ago. And every time I meet someone who is not just like a former evangelical, but a former whatever specific denomination, it's amazing who they end up finding as their entryway into the world of non-theism. It's kind of amazing. So, like, remember, what's the subtitle to Christopher Hitchens' book? Do you remember that? God is Not Great. What's the subtitle to that? Religion poisons everything, which is such a broad thing to say and makes no sense. Because, like, well, what are we talking about? You heard Senator Garriott speaking. I don't think her religion's poisoning anything. But you could see if you're coming from certain of these religious backgrounds, there are certain beliefs that are harmful and did poison you personally, and to have people talking about that stuff and spending a lot of time like talking about that stuff is so amazing. Okay, so that's the second thing that kind of gives me hope that the world of new atheism, it's not like four dudes with one specific mindset. It's a whole bunch of people, and not just like white guys. It's young people, it's people of color, it's a lot of women, and they're talking about all this stuff from their perspectives, and they don't have the reach of Richard Dawkins or Name Your Person, but they definitely connect with their communities, and that is an amazing thing. Here's the last thing I want to bring up that I think is really neat. Believe it or not, we have a lot more allies than we used to as atheists. I used to think, like, it's a dirty word, it's a stigmatized word, and nowadays, even on the highest of stages, people are working with atheists. Like Senator Garriott mentioned, like the interfaith groups she works with. We mentioned the interfaith groups here. I remember there was a time when the interfaith groups wanted nothing to do with atheists because we were too anti-theistic for them. That's not the case. This is an amicus brief that was written for the Dobbs case that overturned Roe, and there's a lot of amicus briefs, but look at who signed on to this particular argument for why Roe v. Wade should remain in place. You have Americans United for Separation of Church and State, the American Humanists Association, a Jewish group, Interfaith Alliance Foundation. Those groups their lawyers banded together to say we have the same argument for why Roe v. Wade should remain in place. This is another Supreme Court brief involving a Christian flag outside Boston's City Hall. But again, check out who signed on to this argument. You got the Anti-Defamation League, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, the Sikh Coalition. Like, that's a group I don't expect to see much of. Oh, by the way, who's also signing on to this? I'm just glancing here. We have the National Council of the Churches of Christ, Hindu American Foundation, Men of Reformed Judaism, here's page 2 of that, Unitarians, American Atheists, American Humanist Association. The fact that all these explicitly non-theistic groups are working with explicitly religious groups who are not afraid of being on the same argument as us, saying, listen, we all have different theological views, but when it comes to church-state separation, we are all on the same page here, and maybe justices might take that more seriously. That's amazing. And here's what that even means. When it comes to like something like the January 6th insurrection and the role Christian nationalism played in it, there was a briefing on Capitol Hill that involved not just atheist groups, but religious groups as well. And because they were working together, they got members of Congress and their staff to attend that briefing. They got people in positions of power to attend that briefing. I can't play this for you right now, but one of the people who attended, not only did that get press, scholars, activists, brief lawmakers on the role of Christian nationalism at the insurrection. Washington Post, how the Capitol attacks helped spread Christian nationalism in the extreme right. Why is that? Why are they getting that press? Because all these groups are working together and saying whatever our theological differences are, we all feel this way. Jared Huffman, the congressman who is the only openly non-theistic member of Congress, gave a speech on the floor of the House where he called out specifically white Christian nationalism as a dangerous ideology. Like, if you think of all the speeches you have seen on the floors of that place, that is one I don't think I expected to hear. Just someone calling out faith-based awfulness in such explicit terms, which is amazing. I'm not going to play the whole thing. This is also really neat. In terms of politics, and I'm not going to get into too much politics here, you have people who were active in nonprofit atheist groups, like national atheist organizations. These are two of them, Sarah and Evan, who went on to form their own consulting agency to help get non-theists elected to the state legislature in Arizona. They got candidates elected to the state legislature, which is amazing. This is Sarah Henry, who's from Florida. She was on the board of the Secular Student Alliance, and then got involved in politics herself, and then ran for Florida State House in 2022. She lost that race, but like the thing they will always tell you about running for office is you should plan to do it for a couple of cycles because you got to learn how to do it the first time. So she's running again this time around for trying to get into the Florida House. But these are people who came up in the atheist movement because they were interested in all the stuff we're all interested in and said the best way I can channel my values, my non-theistic values, is by working in politics. That's the thing the Christian right has done for decades, and we're lagging, but it's starting to happen, which I think is really neat as well. I won't play all these clips, but you have seen these clips, I'm sure, because they get played on cable news channels. They go viral on social media. But in Nebraska, where more progressive politicians are in the minority, they know they don't have the votes to pass legislation that they want to pass. Not too different from Iowa. But this is Megan Hunt, who is an atheist, who basically said, if you're going to pass anything that you think you could just get away with, I'm going to do everything in my power to get in your way, and I will jam up all the stuff if you're passing anti-trans legislation, I'm going to make sure none of your other bills get to the floor, because that's the power I do have. You may have seen this one from Mallory McMorrow, who's from Michigan, who basically said, I am a Christian, but she doesn't want to see Christian arguments being used against LGBTQ students. And when you have all these people, religious and non-religious, making those same arguments, it makes all these non-theistic beliefs seem a lot less threatening than I feel like they used to be a long time ago, which is kind of amazing. I will stop there. I'm just going to leave you with one final thing here, and then if there's any time for questions, we could do it. I was trying to figure out, what's the most, is there another way to show you how our concept of religion has shifted in America and atheism is less denigrated? And I think the most old school way I could think of it is looking at crossword puzzles, because I love crossword puzzles. And it turns out the New York Times crossword, which is the king of all crossword puzzles, they have, because it's such a niche thing and everyone who loves crosswords does the New York Times crossword, there are databases for constructors who make the crosswords to see how many times have certain words come up in a puzzle over the past 25 years and what clues were used to get the words. And the thing is, a 3-letter word like God, if you've ever done a crossword, you're going to see the word God a lot in a puzzle. One, because it has a vowel in the middle, and also because it has 3 letters. There's only so many combinations you could see. So the word God has come up a lot over the past 25 years. And according to the database of all things New York Times crossword, this is the way they clued the word God from 1994 until 1999. Just to give you an example, the Almighty. Yeah, okay, you could see how they would get God from that. First word of the British national anthem. 4th word of the Bible. Word on all U.S. coins. That's the way they clued for the person to say, 3 letters for praise be to blank, must be God. Okay, I solved that part of the puzzle. And here's where I'm going with this. If you look at what they've done with that word alone in the stodgy New York Times crossword over the past few years, here's from 2015 to 2022. Mr. High and Mighty? Jupiter or Mars? I love this. Word in the Declaration of Independence, but not the Constitution. One of 2 words added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954. Thor or Loki? Yeah. Role for George Burns, Morgan Freeman, and Whoopi Goldberg. Even they're not afraid of alienating their audience anymore, because they're no, we can have fun with the word God. We don't have to be so uptight about it. We can poke fun at that word. I think that just shows you how not afraid people are at going after even the most basic religious things. So I'd like to think that's a good pathway moving forward. I'll stop there. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for coming. Sorry, I ran over time.
Yeah, that's fine. I know you've got some time.
I got a little time.
So,
I got a little time. Yeah, if you want
okay.
to. Maybe this.
So, I know you've got some time constraints, but
I can take a few questions?
A few questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Thank you, sir. That was a fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have two observations I'd like to offer and see if you have any response to them. One is that in your discussion of people's drifting away from being theists, I'm 87 years old now, so for 70 years I've been asking friends and relatives, do you believe in God? And over the years I've found that increasingly, until it's almost a dominant answer nowadays, the answer is, well, what do you mean by God? People are thinking of nature as God, they're thinking of the forces that drive the universe as God. So I think people's basic concept of what is God may have changed and affects our statistics in some ways. The other thing I want to comment on is, first I want to make it clear, I'm an atheist, have been since 17 years old. And I don't mean to generalize these remarks to anybody other than myself. But to me, the term atheist is inadequate, just as the word theist is inadequate. It does nothing except one, it ties you to a God, and the other, it frees you from a God. So I consider myself and define myself as a humanist atheist, because to me, I think either theism or atheism lacks an ethical structure as to how to live our lives in relationship to our fellow human beings and the universe. So I call myself a humanist atheist because humanism offers for me that ethical structure to fall back on to guide my behavior in life. Thank you for listening.
Sure. Actually, I can respond to one thing there. The idea that people may not call themselves atheists, as I've heard other people say, it's one answer to one question, but it doesn't tell you anything about what I do believe in. That's why it doesn't really bother me that much that people aren't necessarily embracing the word atheism, but maybe they're embracing a God of nature or a higher power that means absolutely nothing or something like that. That's fine. I also think one thing that's happening is you will see a lot of younger people especially who they might shy away from the word evangelical these days because saying you're evangelical, even if theologically you fit the bill, to them means like, oh, that means you support Trump. There's literally an arguments among statisticians and the people who do that sort of research about how do you figure out who evangelicals are, because how do we ask it? If we say, are you an evangelical? There are a lot of people who are who will not answer yes. And then what do? Do you say, well, do you believe in salvation? Because a lot of people who are evangelical may have different views about that. And they don't know because the labeling is weird and it gets hard. And if people know that the loudest, most prominent evangelicals are people like Pat Robertson, they don't want the label. And honestly, for a lot of young people, when they think of atheist, they are going to think of Dawkins or someone like that who they don't necessarily agree with on a lot of things these days. So does it bother me that they don't want to use that word? No, because I don't care what you are. I kind of care what you do with that belief, going back to your point. So if you're a humanist or you are whatever you want to call that and you don't believe in God, cool. And if you're a Christian who believes on the ethical and moral stuff the same way, like the God thing is such a low priority to me at that point, it's like, we're fine. We'll argue over drinks and we'll do everything else together, you know? So I'm right there with you.
Great talk, thank you. With the Dobbs decision and with the Supreme Court, the
Sure. So the question there is, will there be backlash to these like super religious, super conservative Christian things that they're doing with abortion rights, LGBTQ rights, book banning, all of that stuff? I mean, the answer is yes. It's like a short-term gain to consolidate like the vote, but long-term it's not going to help them out. If you recall, like when the new atheism stuff happened, that was in the middle of the George W. Bush administration, and who used, like, I'm a compassionate conservative. Like, he wore his religion on his sleeve, and years after he got into office, you started seeing, oh, that's what happens when you enact faith-based policies that are hurting people. There's a reason all the new atheism books came out like 4 or 5 years after he got into office. I think the same thing is going to happen now with Trump and all of that, which is we have seen white evangelical Christians ally themselves so much with Trumpism that if you don't like his politics, you're also going to shy away from the religion that doesn't push back against that stuff. Even when, like, what he does in his life and what values they espouse in church, even when those are two very separate things, you will see a lot of people pushing back against it. So yeah, things like book banning, things like abortion, when Republicans specifically are pushing one religious group's view of how this should work, you're not just going to see a backlash like we've seen in Kansas and other states against the politics. You're going to see people walking away from churches too, unless they belong to a church that is actively on the other side of those issues. Like, again, I think it's maybe in their heads good politics for them right now to say we're going to go all in on these culture war issues. But I think long term, it's probably bad for the Republican Party. It's probably bad for conservative churches too. So it doesn't mean it's going to happen. It's not inevitable, but it doesn't look, I would rather be on the other side right now. So.
Couple more?
Sure. By the way, there is my contact information if you have any questions later.
So I've been involved with the atheist humanist community for, I think, about 8 years, and it's been, so I've seen the ups and downs of it, right, kind of follow that trend. One of the things we talk about constantly is kind of the balance between trying to build community for secular people versus kind of activism. The community part is always a challenge, just through the nature of the type of people that don't want to join organizations, don't want to be told what to do, et cetera, et cetera. What is your thought on that? I mean, should the effort be really on trying to establish secular communities, or should it be more towards more activism, more state house kind of stuff?
Sure. Yeah. I get that. The question is, should we basically invest more into building secular communities and all of that? And I mean, part of it is, I think it doesn't matter what thing you're passionate about. It's really hard right now to find communities in general. Like, people are just doing their own thing more. I mean, that's a bigger societal issue. I think it's going to be hard to build a secular community if that's kind of the only glue that is binding everyone together. Now, like, if you're in a place like Iowa that is overrun by religious conservatives, that's something possible. This sort of gathering probably could not happen in blue states as much. It's really hard, but you've seen it firsthand, what's going on. So there, like, in certain areas where religion kind of runs amok, you can form those communities, and that is a powerful thing. In other places, it may not be that you're worried about being out as an atheist or that you have concerns about that. But in those cases, the communities may not be secular ones. They may be communities over ideological issues, cultural issues, politics. A lot of the people I feel I grew up with in the atheist movement who are still passionate and active and they care about these issues, they don't push for atheism. They're working with political organizations to get that sort of thing done. So it's not that their values changed, it's that they found a better outlet for the things that they care about. Because once again, if you're an atheist and you're good, You don't necessarily need a community to be reminded of that all the time, and that conversation would get old after a while. But if the question is, okay, I am an atheist, but what do I do with that? What does that mean in practice? Then maybe, like, fighting for some civil rights group is a better use of your energy. So, like, I have seen attempts at building, like, an atheist church and things like that. They typically don't work, because at some point it's like, okay, I am an atheist. I'm good. What am I coming here for every single week? But if there are causes that bind you together and things you could do, whether it's, trying to make local governments less religious or having a particular issue that you're fighting for, then you can come together, and then you're going to bind people together who care about those issues. So to the broader question, those communities don't seem to be doing well as a whole. There are always some that do really well. But it doesn't mean the people are gone. It just means they've kind of funneled their way into other topical areas that matter. And I don't think that's a loss. I don't think that's a bad thing at all. It's just a matter of what are you trying to bring people together? Under what umbrella? I don't necessarily need to meet every week or every month with other people who are atheists, but I could see a lot of value in gathering regularly with people who care about local schools or the things we were discussing earlier today. That to me is a better use of my atheism, you know what I mean? So I don't know. I would be very curious if the national groups that have made atheism central to what they do, I have seen them care less about trying to get people to be atheists and a lot more about, no, you're already here. The question is, what are we going to do with that? For some groups, like the Freedom from Religion Foundation, it's all about legal issues. For American atheists, it's about how do you help people live as atheists? What resources can we provide them, as opposed to let's just beat people over the head because they happen to be religious? Like, those groups are all shifting too, because being an atheist alone doesn't seem to be doing much for people, by and large.
Again, thank you. And I really loved what you had to say specifically about groups. I didn't know somebody was raised James and became an atheist. So, but anyway, good that you have. But I also spend a lot of time on Reddit and sometimes the deep Reddits and on 4chan. And certainly my husband can tell you when he was working in Texas and going to the atheist group, there are a lot of far-right atheists. And they are growing. And there's a lot of right libertarian atheists that are growing. And I know American Atheists recently had an article about it, but I think as a group, as we've been saying, if the categories atheism means one thing, no belief in God, it doesn't mean you're good. It doesn't mean religious people are bad, and it doesn't mean you're good because you're an atheist. But how are we going to handle the far right? Because soon they may dominate. We see an atheist, we say, oh well, you like Richard Spencer.
Right.
Right? So I think that's something that in the future we're going to have to really address and separate ourselves from the two types of atheists.
Yeah.
What do you feel about that?
Thanks. Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic. There are a handful of prominent, or at least atheists with a large platform, who have definitely taken right-wing views on LGBTQ rights, trans rights especially, and some other culture war issues as well. Here's what's interesting about that. When it comes to, like, the surveys I showed you, that's not happening with atheists or non-religious people at large. Like, let's not confuse a handful of people with large platforms with what's happening overall, because it's not there is no big rightward shift among atheists overall. What scares me is that, yeah, there's a lot of really well-known atheists who are taking really bizarre, awful stances on a lot of things. The question is, one, how many people are actually following them on those issues? And it seems like some of those people have way more conservative Christian supporters than they do other atheists. Like, their atheism isn't gaining them any fans necessarily. Like, there's a couple names, I don't want to mention their names, but there's a couple of people who end up, who are atheists, who say all these right-wing things, but the only people who care to listen to them are other conservative Christians. So it's just a weird dynamic in that sense. To your question about, like, what are we going to do about that? I don't know what we are going to do about that, because as any movement grows, you are going to have those fissures. What I would be paying attention to is if there are large organizations that get any traction. Right now, name any large atheist group you can think of, like the national ones that have been around for a while. With one exception, and it's not even a huge exception, they've by and large been on the progressive side of all the ethical issues. And that, to me, seems like a good sign that the groups are not going anywhere. The people that are trying to lead people down that other path haven't gotten any traction. So, like, again, there's a difference between a handful of loud voices and, like, an actual movement on that side. And I would also say, like, it's not like Republicans have embraced their atheism at all. They're using their mouthpieces. Like, hey, if you want to attack critical race theory, we're happy to have you. We don't care about your atheism. It's irrelevant to us. So, like, I think one example of that is there is a handful of, like, right-wing atheists who are like, we're going to CPAC. Why? Because we want to recruit members. Like, buddy, they're not becoming atheists. They're just like, if that's the group you want to attract, then you can't pretend to be for reason. So I'm not really sure who you're trying to draw into your club here. So I don't know. I'm not worried about it as a whole yet. I am definitely disturbed. Like, I'll see Richard Dawkins say things that I find abhorrent. I'll see other people with that level of, like, notoriety say things that are disgusting. At the same time, I also see a lot of atheists just saying, he doesn't represent me. He's not my... It's a lot easier for us to say Dawkins doesn't represent me because, like we mentioned earlier, atheism is the only thing that connects us. There's a lot of things that don't, versus we have Jesus in common or whatever. Like, I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question.
You good?
I can do one more.
One more?
If that's okay. Yeah.
Okay, one more.
There's one over there. There's one over there. She was raising her hand for a while.
I just have a quick question. What do you recommend? How can we get younger people involved?
The question is, how can we get younger people involved? In what?
Well, I'm with IAF and we do a lot of activism. So, reproductive rights rallies, separation of church and state rallies.
Yeah. So how do we get younger people involved in those issues? For me, as an atheist who also cares about a lot of these issues, I think the thing that would draw more people, whether or not they are atheists, into that fold is, instead of arguing about atheism, right, which is not that important of an issue, all things considering, what seems to be working for a lot of the organizations, for a lot of the activists, is finding issues where religion itself is the basis for the problem. So, like, why are people opposed to trans rights? There are a handful of people who will make some scientific argument about it, but by and large, it's my religion says God made us this way. It is really easy to say I'm for trans rights or I'm for abortion rights because the people who oppose it are by and large doing it for religious reasons. That, to me, is how you get people interested, not just in the atheism thing, if you do that, if you lose your faith in God on your spare time, cool, but I don't care. But that's a religious issue that there are multiple sides on that we have the ethical backdrop for. And if you fight for that issue and say, look, I don't care what you believe, but we're fighting for this, we're against book bans because they hurt all of us, you're going to get, and if you're working with groups that are actively supporting those causes, you're going to find a lot of allies. And if along the way they realize, oh, like, by and large, the atheists are on my side, Jewish groups are on my side on this thing, there's a lot of progressive Christians on my side on this thing, you're going to end up working together on a lot of these issues. I think the biggest thing is there's a lot of huge cultural issues where religion is at the center of it in some way. And for those of us who care about atheism and humanism and where that takes us, working with groups that share our humanistic values, that's a better way to get young people engaged. And then if they lose their faith in God, cool, but like, I'm not keeping the tally marks anywhere. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all.
I don't know what to say. That was wonderful. That was wonderful. Safe travels
Thank you.
on your way home, and thanks for coming to Iowa.
Thank you. Thank you all.